Leviticus chapter 11. I told you last week, I think, that these are probably my least favorite 4 chapters in the whole Bible. Ted, I just don't get warm fuzzies when I read Leviticus chapters 11 through 14. Yes, not like any 4 chapters in the New Testament at all. What do you think, Nick?
Not even.
Did you read all 4? I don't want to embarrass you, but
No,
did
I didn't.
you? Yeah. You, well, okay.
Well,
I didn't know if you got past chapter 11, verse 1.
I did make it past that.
Okay, you made it past verse 1. Okay, so, but interestingly enough, the 3 topics that are discussed in these 4 chapters, every one of them have some connection with the New Testament. Isn't that interesting? The 4 chapters that, and I've read Leviticus, I've been reading the whole Bible since 1996, so I've read Leviticus probably 32, 33 or more times, and I would just as soon skip over these chapters. But if I'm going to read the book, I'm going to read those chapters. And yet, the New Testament has some connection with every one of these topics. So chapter 11 is clean and unclean animals. Was there anything that you found remarkable about this list of animals that they could eat or not eat? Who'd want to eat them anyway? I guess if I was living out in the desert, I would be looking for something to eat. Like Cody says about breathing, eating is at the top of my list of things to do every day. But some of these animals, obviously, I mean, lizards. Lizards are among the unclean animals, and I don't have a problem with that. Rachel and I tried out at a church in Florida years ago, and we came out of the restaurant where the elders had taken us, and there were lizards all over the sidewalk. And Rachel's like, I don't want to live here. Yeah, they get in the house. Who wants lizards in the house? So the first characteristic, or first set of characteristics, of course, we're probably familiar with this. It has to have a split hoof and chew its cud. Okay, the biological term for that is a ruminant. Animals like cows that have 4 stomachs, and it goes into one stomach, comes back up, and they re-chew it, and it goes to another part of the stomach, and then it comes back up. I started to say barf it up. It comes back up, and they chew it again, goes to another stomach, and they chew it again. I mean, if you live on plants all the time, you need to break down all of that fiber. But these animals in Leviticus chapter 11, they've got to have both those characteristics in order for them to be clean. If they have one but not the other, it's still unclean. Now, this distinction between clean and unclean animals was not just among the Jews or Israelites. Other ancient Near Eastern peoples also had their list of clean and unclean animals, and in fact, what other major event in biblical history dealt with clean and unclean animals? Noah's Ark. We'll come to Acts chapter 10. But I was thinking of Noah's Ark. So way back, hundreds of years before God gave the nation of Israel the law of Moses, Noah already knew that there was some distinction between clean and unclean animals. So this was nothing new to the nation of Israel. I'm hitting the highlights, obviously, because I want to cover all 4 chapters tonight. But God also said if you touched an unclean animal, then you were unclean. You couldn't eat it. You couldn't touch it. If it was in the water, now the split hoof and the ruminant was for land animals. If it was in the water, it had to have scales and fins. Now, what animal do we typically eat today from the water that does not have scales? Catfish. So catfish is unclean. I think it is hilarious when somebody comes to the food pantry and they say, I can't eat pork. I'm not going to eat pork. And we say, well, what about catfish? Yeah, I'll eat that. I don't think you've ever read Leviticus 11. Oh, catfish is good. Charleston, South Carolina, catfish capital of the United States. Grits, bowl of grits covered in butter with catfish. Do what?
I thought that was Arkansas.
Arkansas?
That's all they know.
I misspelled detestable, but in verse 9, God says these certain animals are detestable. Interestingly, in verse 10, the New American Standard uses the same word but translates it differently as abhorrent. But it's the same word in Hebrew, and it's used 11 times. So God wanted Israel to understand there are certain animals that you're just not supposed to eat. There are certain animals that are detestable. And then he says, here are some detestable birds. Anything that strikes you about that list of birds? Vulture. Who would want to eat a vulture to begin with? Who would want to eat an eagle? In the United States, you'd be put in jail, at least with a bald eagle. So there wasn't a rule of thumb when it came to birds. God just said, here's a list of birds you cannot eat. Winged insects that walk on all fours are detestable, but if they have above their feet jointed legs to jump, you could eat. Like locusts. Who in the Bible is famous for eating locusts? John the Baptist. Eating locusts. Would any of y'all eat locusts? Anybody want to raise your hand if you eat locusts? Ken Hickmott probably would. He's always bragging about eating different things. I'll eat snake. I've not tried it. We're going to Arizona in October. Maybe I'll find a place that serves snake. I have had alligator tail fried. You can eat anything fried. Fried possum, fried coon. You can eat anything fried. All right, locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers. There, in Joel will mention 4 different types of locusts, and they're all different words in Hebrew. So apparently they recognize different species or subspecies of locusts. And locusts and grasshopper are two different creatures. Now, incidentally, if you were to compare different translations of these list of animals, don't be surprised if they translate them differently. It's not like translators can go and pull a book off the shelf and say, okay, here is the definition or translation of this particular word. They can't. This language is 5,000 years old or so. So sometimes, if they can find out from the Bible itself, or they can find out from other ancient Near Eastern languages, then they'll say, okay, here's likely what it means because we can tell this is what it means in Arabic or whatever language, Aramaic. Or sometimes they'll look at a similar verb and they'll say, okay, here's what the verb means, therefore here is probably what the noun means based on the verb and based on the animals that we know that live in that area. And yet, there's not animals today in that area that they had back then. So, it's a little bit of guesswork in some of these translations. If you touch a carcass, you are unclean until evening, and you have to wash your clothes. Don't touch dead animals. Isn't that a good rule of thumb? Isn't that what your mom and dad taught you when you were little? Don't touch dead animals. Now, God didn't tell Israel about bacteria and viruses and all of that. He just said, don't touch the animals and trust me. It's that trust part we have problems with. Whatever walks on paws is unclean. What would that include? Canines and felines and ursines or whatever bears are. If it walks on the paws, it's unclean. So you can't eat your dog and your cat. If you touch their carcass, you're unclean. You have to wash your clothes. And then he goes on, verses 26 through 38. Let's just make a list of other creepy crawly things, and they're all unclean. Just don't eat them. Don't touch them. Like moles and mice and lizards. Anybody want to eat mice? I don't think God would have to tell me, don't eat mice. Clarence? Iguanas.
In Spain, I was offered a delicacy. It was baby eels.
Baby eels.
What baby eels look like? Earthworms.
Huge earthworms.
That's the first time I turned down eating anything in my life.
Is there anybody who's had fish eggs? Anybody had fish eggs? Penny's had fish eggs. When we were in Romania back in June, I had never tried fish eggs before. When we were in Romania back in June, we ate with our lawyer and his wife, and she had a table full of traditional Romanian food so that our team could taste what. Marvin, did you try? You didn't try the fish eggs. She said, Paul, I made fish eggs, and I'd like for you to try them. How can I turn her down? Easy. No, thank you. I was full because I'd eaten lots of other stuff, but I had to try it. So I got like half a spoon and put it on my plate. It was good. It was good. I could not tell from the texture that it was eggs. She had onions in it, mayonnaise, maybe some garlic. I thought it tasted good. I think it would have been better if I'd have put it on a slice of bread, made like an open-faced sandwich. I think that would have been good. If any of these unclean animals dies and falls on some object in the home, then that object also becomes unclean. And you have to wash it. Now, if it's pottery, earthenware, it has to be broken and never reused. I think the heart of this text is at the very end of the chapter, and we'll get to that in just a second. If the water is contaminated, it and the food from that water that the water touches, it's all unclean. An oven or stove that is touched by any of those animals has to be smashed. So if you have a mouse in your house and it runs across your stove, you got to get rid of the stove. That would motivate you to keep a clean house, wouldn't it? If it's running water, it's clean. Now, from a bacteria perspective, what's the difference between standing water and running water? Why would standing water be unclean and running water be okay? Because it's fresh. If there's bacteria on the animal, then the stagnant is going to hold it, right? But the running water is going to wash it away, so running water is safe. Seeds are clean if they're touched by a carcass. Why would that be okay? You're going to plant the seed and it's going to grow into a plant. So the contaminant, whatever might be in the animal, is not going to be passed on to the plant through the seed. Seeds have a casing. The casing has to break open for the plant to come out. Unless unclean water touches the seeds, obviously, then it could soak into it. So that makes sense too. Marvin. Use fish as fertilizer. Yeah. Native Americans did that, didn't they? Touching an unclean animal makes you unclean. Wash your clothes. God repeats that several times, doesn't he? Swarming things are detestable. They're unclean. So then he gives a summary. Anything crawling on its belly, walking on all fours, has many feet. They're all detestable. Don't make yourself detestable. Notice God says you can make yourself detestable if you eat what I tell you not to eat. By touching an unclean animal. All right, look at the last few verses of the chapter. Not the very last verses, but verse 44. So obviously, especially with pork not cooked well, it can cause some serious problems. But God doesn't tell Israel to eat this animal or stay away from this animal because of health reasons. Now today we can look back and say, yeah, that was obviously smart. Look at what God says in the text. Verse 44, "For I am the Lord your God, consecrate yourselves therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And ye shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth, for I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt, to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy." This is the law regarding the animals, the animal and the bird, and every living thing that moves in the waters, and everything that swarms on the earth. Notice verse 47, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, and between the edible creature and the creature which is not to be eaten. Consecrate yourselves. Eat the food that I tell you you have the right to eat. Consecrate yourselves. Live differently. Live holy because I am holy. I am different from the world. Therefore, I have determined that certain animals are unclean to you. Certain animals are clean. You eat the clean animals. Don't eat the unclean animals and don't even touch them. I want you to learn to make a distinction. Now, again, the health aspects of these animals might be foremost in God's mind. He didn't bring that up. What He brought up is, I've made a distinction, and you need to recognize that distinction. Todd. Right. Right. Well, that was the purpose in him repeating himself here several times. You're unclean until evening, and then you have to wash your clothes. And then the next day they would be clean again. So as far as I could tell, and this is the only place where clean and unclean animals are discussed in the law, as far as I could tell, they were unclean for 24 hours. Or that day, you might say. And then they could return to their business the next day. Which, obviously, that could be very inconvenient. How inconvenient is it for your computer to go down? Okay? Imagine how inconvenient it would be for... When I was in college, I preached in southern Illinois, in Vienna, Illinois, and that Sunday afternoon, I was in the church office looking over my Sunday night sermon, and a mouse ran up my leg. That was cool. I caught it at my knee. So then I walk outside like this and shake it loose. And it runs out into the field. But then I'd be unclean. Under the law of Moses, I'd be unclean. And nobody could touch me. And everything I touched would be unclean. Here's the connection with the New Testament now, and that first text there is especially important. We're not going to look at it, okay? We don't have time to go look at it. If you want to write the notes down, you can, obviously. Mark chapter 7 is where the Pharisees criticized Jesus for not washing his hands before he ate. And to them, it was precautionary. You might have brushed up against a carcass in the market. Therefore, you need to wash before you ate, just in case. It was always just in case. It wasn't that you actually became unclean. It was just in case you become unclean. And then they elevated that, of course, to being equivalent to a law out of God's mouth. So in Mark chapter 7, especially beginning in verse 14, Jesus says, it's not what goes into a man that makes him unclean. It's what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. And then he goes on to give a list of sins that come out of the heart of man, and he says that's what makes people unclean. In that text, specifically verse 19, Mark tells us, the author of the Gospel of Mark tells us that when Jesus says it's what comes out of a man that makes him unclean, not what goes into the man that makes him unclean, Mark says when Jesus said this, he declared that all foods are clean. Now, Mark wrote after the church was established. But Mark gives his readers that note in there to emphasize to them, Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians, there's no distinction between animals anymore. Acts chapter 10 is a passage that Rachel mentioned. Y'all recall this is Cornelius. Cornelius wants to be saved. God tells Cornelius to send men to Joppa to bring Simon Peter to tell him what to do to be saved. In the meantime, God sends Simon Peter a vision. Sheet comes down out of heaven with all kinds of animals in the sheet, clean and unclean. And God says, Peter, kill and eat. Peter was a faithful Jew. He says, Lord, at no time have my lips ever touched an unclean animal. And what did God tell Peter?
He said, don't consider something unclean that is made clean.
Yep. What I have called clean, don't you call unclean. And God did that to Peter 3 times. Peter was scratching his head. Men came from Cornelius and said, God sent us through Cornelius for you to come and tell Cornelius what to do to be saved. When Peter goes, Peter realizes at that point the meaning of the vision. And he tells Cornelius in verses 34 and 35, "Now I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he who fears God and works righteousness is acceptable to him." That's when Peter realized the significance of that vision, and that there's no longer any distinction between clean and unclean animal, and there's no longer any distinction between Jew and Gentile. Yes. Didn't sink in. Jesus had already told them that just a second, Rosemary. And Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20, Mark 16, Jesus says, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to everybody." But the Christians didn't do it until Acts chapter 10. They needed a kick in the pants, didn't they? Okay, Rosemary. No, you don't have to worry about eating catfish. You never did have to worry about eating catfish because you ain't a Jew. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 5 is the other text that I want to draw your attention to relative to clean and unclean animals. The Apostle Paul says some people were teaching that some foods were not to be eaten, but he says anything can be eaten as long as it's done with thanksgiving. As long as it's done with thanksgiving. There are no more food laws in the New Covenant. The second chapter that we're looking at tonight is chapter 12. Chapter 12 is very short. It has to do with childbirth. If you give birth to a boy, you're unclean. You're unclean for 7 days, just like a woman is during her menstrual cycle. He will come back to the menstrual cycle in chapter 15, and we'll look at that next week. In fact, any bodily discharges makes a person unclean, which means the whole sexual relationship made you unclean. So being unclean is not a sin. That was a misunderstanding I myself had for years. But just because somebody was unclean doesn't mean it was sinful. Giving birth to a baby made you unclean. But obviously that's not sinful because God's the one that designed it that way. So a woman was unclean for 7 days when she gave birth to a boy, and then she was supposed to circumcise him on the 8th day. Now today we give injections to newborn babies, at least boys. Maybe Sherry can answer it if it's girls too, but vitamin K, right? Give them vitamin K injection when they're born. Then you can circumcise them, But back then, it was at the highest level on the 8th day. So God said you circumcise them on the 8th day. And then mom was unclean for another 33 days. And she can't go into the temple complex, the courtyard, offered animal sacrifices or what have you, during that period of time. If she had a girl, she was also unclean. She was unclean for 14 days, 2 weeks. I don't know why God breaks it up. You can ask him one day. But then she's unclean for another 66 days. Why was she unclean twice as long for a girl as she was a boy? Nobody knows. And out of the 17 or 18 commentaries I've read, nobody has any reasonable suggestions. Maybe you've got a suggestion that's reasonable. If you have it, speak up. Otherwise, we don't know. Now, after that period of time, mom was to bring a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering to make atonement for her. If she was poor, she could bring 2 turtle doves and 2 pigeons, one for a sin offering, one for a burnt offering. Sin offering was to take care of sin, obviously. Burnt offering was to show commitment and dedication to God. This is where we get the idea that Joseph and Mary were poor. Because what did Mary bring to offer to God when Jesus was circumcised? Luke chapter 2. 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. Text doesn't say what she brought, but it quotes this text. Anybody got any thoughts or comments or questions on chapters 11 and 12 before we jump into leprosy? Clean and unclean. There are some behaviors that God does not accept. And there are obviously behaviors that God does accept. For Christians, the behaviors that reflect Christ is what's good and right. I just came across an article. I have not read it yet. I emailed it to myself to read it at some point. But it's from The Guardian, which is a newspaper out of Great Britain. But the title of the article was, "This woman decided to give up telling little white lies, and here's what's happened." Doesn't that just make you want to read it? There are some behaviors God just doesn't tolerate. And he doesn't tolerate lying. That's one of them. It makes you unclean. All right, let's talk about leprosy. The Bible word for leprosy does not refer to, let me reword that. It does not always refer to the disease that is contagious and causes skin cells to die and body parts to decompose and so forth. Maybe you've seen some pictures. They're not very pleasant to look at, where somebody's part of their cartilage on their nose is deteriorated, maybe their ears and so forth. That's called Hansen's disease. And that would be included in the Bible word leprosy. But the Bible word for leprosy refers to any skin condition. Okay, last year I had a rash or something on my side. And Rachel and I treated it with everything we could think of before I went to the doctor. And it didn't go away. And I went to a dermatologist, and he gave me 2 ointments that were steroids. One was extremely strong. He said use that for 10 days or 2 weeks, and then go to the other one, which was not quite as strong. And month, 6 weeks or so, it went by, and it finally disappeared. They actually took a little piece of my skin. They took enough to do a biopsy. They took enough of it where they had to do stitches to close it back up. And the biopsy didn't really tell him much of anything. He did suggest, I think it was morphia. He said he thought it was morphia. So I texted Ashton, because he was taking a dermatology class at the time, and I said, "I've got morphia," and he looked it up. He said, "Usually it's black females that get morphia." I said, "Well, Ashton, I just identify as a white male." Leprosy in the Bible refers to any skin condition. Now, what they had to be careful of was that it was not contagious, because they didn't know. Okay? Now, interestingly, the requirements for quarantine and isolation that we see in chapters 13 and 14 were ahead of its time, as we would expect. Again, God doesn't get into the details about bacteria and viruses. They couldn't have seen them if he had brought it up, right? Because we didn't even have the microscope until Anton von Leeuwenhoek developed it. So God just had to say, stay away from it. We're not going to go into details, obviously, on these chapters, because they're very long chapters, and we don't want to read them. So, swelling, scab, bright spot, you've got to go to the priest. The priest is the one who determines whether or not you're clean or unclean. Has it turned white? If you've read it carefully, you've noticed that there are some patterns that happens with these things. Is it deeper than the skin? Is there raw flesh showing? If those conditions are true, then the person is unclean. If it's white but it's not deeper than the skin, then you have to quarantine him for 7 days. Quarantine for 7 days. After 7 days, you go back to the priest. Or the priest comes to you, because you have to be outside the camp. Priest takes another look. If it's not spread, he's quarantined for another 7 days. After 14 days, if it's faded and has not spread, then he's clean. Then he has to wash his clothes. If there's anything in the clothes, bacteria or whatever, wash them, get them clean. If it's spread, you got to go back to the priest. In fact, the dermatologist, with my rash, he wanted to know, has it spread? Is it getting bigger? So the same thing was true there. The priest decides if he's clean or unclean. If it's white, raw flesh, he's unclean, but he doesn't have to quarantine him if it's white. For whatever reason, that gave a good indication. If it breaks out all over but it's white, he's clean. If there's raw flesh, he's unclean. If he's got boils on his skin, he has to handle it the same way. Who in the Bible had boils on their skin? Job. Job had boils, but Job lived before the law of Moses was given as far as we can tell. Burns are handled the same way. If you have a burn. If you have something on the head or in the beard, if it's thin yellowish hair, then the person's unclean. And he has to be quarantined for 7 days, and he has to shave. And then, of course, when the hair comes back out, then you take a look at it and see if it's still there. You've got a big problem if it's still there. Scaly skin is handled the same way. You see how we've got different skin conditions? And basically, they're all handled the same way. Now, I like verse 40. Verse 40, God explicitly says, a bald head is clean. When I was preaching in southern Illinois, I was preaching with a friend of mine, and the two of us were standing out in the foyer after services one Sunday morning, and my friend Les said something sarcastic about me being bald, and I said, you know, God only made so many beautiful heads, and the rest of them he covered with hair. Well, there was a woman that was standing right there, and he said, are you telling me her head is ugly? I said, let's change the subject. If the spot, the hair, or whatever is reddish white, then he's unclean. Now, here is what a leper had to do if he was unclean. He had to tear his clothes. What's the bad part about tearing your clothes back in those days? They were handmade. That's why ripping the clothes as a sign of repentance was a big deal. Because you didn't have needles and machines back then. At least not the kind of needles we have today, sewing machines. The hair had to be uncovered. They had to cover the lip. The New American Standard says mustache. The word is lip. Women don't have mustaches. So he had to cover the lip and he had to cry out, unclean, unclean. Why did they have to cry out unclean? Because somebody might touch and then they become unclean. So you had to let people know, get out of my way, don't touch me because I am unclean. And they had to live alone. They had to live outside the camp. So a leper was socially isolated. And it was for the health and the good of the rest of the nation of Israel. Clothes had to be shown to the priest. Now this doesn't refer to just the lepers. Anybody that has some clothes that had some discoloration in it, they had to take the clothes to the priest. Clothes had to be quarantined for 7 days. If it spread, then the clothes were unclean. You had to burn them. Again, that's a big deal in a culture where you have to make your clothes by hand from scratch. If it's not spread, then you wash it and you quarantine for another 7 days. So maybe this gives us a little deeper insight into the occasions when Jesus healed lepers. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 occasions where Jesus healed a leper. And when Jesus touched the leper, what did he communicate? He was clean. What else? Go show yourself to the priest. So Jesus could not declare him legally based on the law of Moses. Jesus couldn't declare him clean, could he? Because he wasn't a priest. So he said, you go show yourself to the priest. And of course, there were sacrifices he had to offer as a part of the becoming clean process. And that's what chapter 14 is about. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But of course, when Jesus touched the leper, when was the last time that leper had been touched? Might very well have been a long time. So Jesus is communicating love and acceptance and warmth by touching him. And of course, Jesus healed him at the point. Then we have the reference to Simon the leper. That is not a healing miracle there, but we assume that if Jesus is in his house eating with him, then he had to have been cleansed. Right? Otherwise, Jesus wouldn't be associating with him in that kind of environment. And so the presumption is Jesus healed Simon the leper. Luke chapter 5. Then Luke chapter 17 is the 10 lepers, the 9 ingrates. who got healed. When were they healed? When were those guys healed? Jesus didn't touch all 10 of them, did he? Go to the priest, and as they went, they were cleansed. They were healed. And one of them came back, and he happened to be a Samaritan. So those were lepers. And those are the references to healing of leprosy in the New Testament. I find it interesting that there's no reference to lepers or leprosy in the book of Acts or through the rest of the New Testament. I don't know what that means. I just find it interesting. Marvin.
But there's a phrase in the New King James that I noticed this is either in the warp or in the wolf. I see it about 5 or 6 times, but I have no idea.
Ask Becky Jones, Rachel says. What verse are you looking at? We'll see what the other translations say. Okay, everybody look at chapter 13, verse 48. Okay, Donna is the expert, and Donna says it just has to do with the way the fibers are woven. Okay, warp, woof. Okay? Or this might be warp and this is woof. Either way, that's the fibers. That's the direction of the fibers. The only ignorant question is the one that's not asked. There you go. Now you can sleep well tonight, Marvin. Okay, in the New Testament, we have unclean spirits. 22 times the phrase is used. What's another word for unclean spirits? Evil spirits or demons. Romans 14 and verse 14. This is a context where Paul is trying to help Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians have unity with each other. How are you going to have unity? How are you going to have a potluck meal if nobody brings pork? Right? You got to have pork at a potluck meal. So the Jewish Christians, they may not bring pork. The Gentile Christians are saying, look, we can't have a potluck meal if nobody's going to bring pork. Paul says, Romans 14 and verse 14, I know and am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself. But to him who thinks anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. It's okay to have pork at the potluck meal, and if Jewish Christians don't want to eat it, they don't want to touch it, fine. Don't criticize them for it. Let them eat their chicken if they want to. Jewish Christians, don't criticize the Gentile Christians for eating pork. It's okay. Everything's clean in the eyes of God under the new covenant. There is a degree of everything is black and white. We just don't see everything as black and white. We want there to be gray, but in God's eyes, it's either right or wrong. And so, if we've got different views on certain things, it's okay to have different views. We don't have to see everything the same way. We just have to agree on what the Bible teaches. Chapter 14. What do you do to become clean? Beyond washing clothes. That's included. All right, you got to call the priest. I think the reason why priests in the Catholic Church are involved in everything you do from birth to death is because priests in the old law was involved in everything you did from birth to death. Okay, even if a mom gives birth, who's the one who is involved in her becoming clean again? The priest. So in Catholic theology develops the idea of the priest from the Old Testament and the New Testament and, to be honest, paganism. Subject for a different time. Anyway, you got to call the priest. You're outside the camp because you're socially isolated. You've got to have 2 clean birds. Not any of those birds that God said are unclean. Got to have 2 clean birds. And you've got to have cedar and scarlet string and hyssop. The Bible does not say explicitly what the scarlet string and hyssop was for. I'm imagining that the string is used to tie the cedar to one of these birds, because you kill one of the birds over a pottery bowl and running water, and then you tie, I'm guessing, that's my guess, you tie the live bird with the scarlet string and the wood and the hyssop, and then you dip it in the blood of the dead bird, you sprinkle it, and that live bird's going, so you sprinkle the live bird with this blood on the cleansed leper. And then he becomes clean. And then you turn the live bird loose. And Nick, he's flying away saying, man, what did I do to deserve that? Now, if you want to know why God required that, you're just going to have to wait. I think it's a rather odd ritual myself, but it's what God required. The cleansed leper washes his clothes, shaves his hair, bathes, and can re-enter the camp, but he has to sleep outside of his tent for 7 days. Then after 7 days, he shaves again, washes his clothes, bathes, and he's clean. And then on the 8th day, he's got to take 2 lambs that are perfect without defect and a year-old ewe lamb, 3/10 of an ephah of flour for a grain offering, come to the doorway of the tent of meeting, and then the priest, of course, helps him. 1 lamb is offered as a guilt offering, included with the wave offering, though wave offering, scholars think wave offering was lifting the priest gets the right breast and the right thigh, remember, so they're waving it to God and then waving it back to the priest because he gets to eat it. And then the blood of the sacrifice is daubed on the right earlobe and the right thumb and the right big toe, just like when the priests were put into office back in chapter 8 and 9. Now, why the ear? We don't know. Why do we think? What does it mean? The ear. Why did they daub blood on the ear? To emphasize listening to God, right? How about the thumb? Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see, and so forth. Yeah, dedicate your whole body to God. So your ear is for listening, your hand is for doing, your feet is for going. Then the oil, olive oil, is poured into the left palm, and with the right finger, he dips his finger in the oil in the palm, and then he sprinkles it 7 times towards the tabernacle, probably. The text says towards the Lord, probably in the direction of the tabernacle. And then the remaining oil is daubed on the right ear, right thumb, right big toe, and then the rest of the oil is poured over the head of the cleansed leper. Now, what if a priest comes along and says, well, I want to hold the oil in my right hand and dip my left hand in it? Can you even imagine a priest asking that? I think it's just asinine to think that a priest would ask that. You do it the way God said to do it. Like with the Lord's Supper, you do it the way God said to do it. The sin offering is offered to make atonement, burnt offering with a grain offering to make atonement. If they're poor, they would offer a male lamb for a guilt offering. With the wave offering, 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour. And then 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons could be used for the sin offering, the burnt offering, if they were poor, that they couldn't afford the lambs. On the 8th day, the lamb was offered for a guilt offering with a wave offering. Again, the blood is daubed on the earlobe, on the right thumb, on the right toe. Oil poured in the left palm, sprinkled with the right finger before the Lord. Once again, oil. The oil that was left over is daubed on the earlobe, right thumb, right toe. The rest is poured over the head. So, we always talk about the Messiah fulfills the picture of the priest being anointed, the prophets being anointed, the king being anointed. Well, those weren't the only people who were anointed in the sense that oil was poured over their head. When a man became clean from leprosy, or a woman became clean from leprosy, then they had oil poured over their head as well. Not that Jesus fulfills that idea. I don't know if there's that kind of connection. But they were to make atonement and then offer turtle doves and pigeons, what he can afford. We finish up with the last section here. It's a pretty large section, but what about if you have leprosy in the house? What if you see leprosy on the or some discoloration in the wall? I mentioned Sunday our preacher friend who has a sensitivity to black mold spores. Well, if you see something in your house, well, the law says empty the house before the priest comes. Because once the priest comes, if the priest determines that the house is unclean, guess what happens to all that stuff in the house? It's unclean, at least. So, green or red depressions, is it deeper than the surface? Just like with the skin, is it deeper than the surface? Then you are to quarantine the house for 7 days, so you got to go live with your in-laws for a week. And then they go back after 7 days and look to see if it's spread. They tear out the stones and the plaster, and you take them outside of the city. Okay, everything unclean goes outside the city. That's why the Valley of Hinnom came to be called Gehenna, which becomes a metaphor for hell. Everything outside the city is unclean. And so you dump the plaster outside, you replace the stones. If the mark spreads out again a second time, then you've got to tear the house down. And all the debris gets dumped outside the city. Now, just like with clothes, what's the big deal with having to tear your house down? You got to build it yourself. Sun-baked bricks, trees, if they're living in Israel by this time, it's not a quick process, is it? Although even in the United States, we had these house raisings, the whole community comes together, and raises the house. So it probably didn't take them all that long. If you enter or eat in the house, then you're unclean because the house is unclean. You have to wash your clothes. If it's not spread and the priest determines that it hasn't spread, then the house is clean. Now, to clean your house, you got to take 2 birds, cedar, scarlet string, and hyssop, and guess what? You got to rattle the brains of that bird again. Kill 1 bird, bowl of pottery over running water, take the live bird, tie it up with the cedar and the scarlet string and the hyssop, dip it in the blood of the dead bird, and then sprinkle the house to make atonement for the house. Now notice God says to teach when they are clean and when they're unclean. The Levites' responsibility was to teach the nation of Israel. They largely didn't. And that's why God raised up prophets, because they were outside of the political structure. By the time Jesus comes along, the priesthood is all politics. Annas and Caiaphas, they're just politicians. Politicians in a robe. And so that's why God raised up prophets to preach the word of God. We have a few stories in the Old Testament. I wanted to draw your attention to a few studies in the Old Testament that deal with leprosy. 2 Kings chapter 5. Who is it that had leprosy in 2 Kings chapter 5? Naaman. Naaman sent a messenger to the king of Israel saying, I want to be healed of my leprosy. And the king of Israel said, am I God that I could heal somebody of leprosy? So it was considered to be a big deal. Only God could heal leprosy. So if Jesus comes along and he can heal leprosy, what does that mean about Jesus? He's God. 2 Kings chapter 7 is a really interesting story. Go read 2 Kings chapter 7 before you go to bed tonight. We've got lepers who are outside of the camp, and the Arameans leave. They get scared and they leave, and there's all this plunder, and the lepers are enjoying themselves, and they say, look, guys, this is a day of good news. We can't keep this all to ourselves. And so then they go into the city and they share the good news that there's all this stuff that the Arameans left behind. And then 2 Chronicles chapter 26, we've got King Uzziah. He's also known as King Azariah, who decided that he had the authority from God to offer incense on the altar. But he was not from the tribe of Levi, and so God struck him with leprosy until the day he died. So not only could God heal somebody from leprosy, he could actively strike somebody with leprosy. Who else did God strike with leprosy? Who else did God strike with leprosy? Moses' sister, yeah, Miriam. When she complained, who died and made Moses boss? In essence, that's what older sisters are like that. So God struck her with leprosy. Aaron was complaining too, but God didn't strike Aaron with leprosy. You can ask God why one day. Anybody got any thoughts or comments or questions on that chapter? Rachel? Oh, yeah. Older sisters are like that. Chapters 15 and 16, maybe 17 next week. Go ahead and read chapter 17. Chapter 16 and 17 both have to do with the Day of Atonement. And I think we could cover chapter 15 pretty quickly. Sometimes these laws, I could just make a list. When God makes a list, this sin causes death, this sin is death penalty, this sin is death penalty. We don't have to read every verse. We can just summarize it. If you don't have any questions, we'll end with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we are thankful for the day and for the blessings that you give us. Keep us in your care until we can come together again on the Lord's day. In his name we pray. Amen.